Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We now begin session C titled Unexplored Drivers of Maternal and Child Health. This session will be chaired by Dr. Faiza Jahan. Dr. Faiza Jahan is chair and professor of pediatrics and child health at the Aga Khan University, where she also holds the Ruby and Kareem Bahadur Ali Jisani Endowed Chair. A clinician, educator, and prolific global health researcher. Her work spans the full spectrum of maternal, newborn, and child health. She serves on major international boards, including the WHO Stage Committee, Johns Hopkins International Health Partnerships Advisory Council, and the MRC Applied Global Health Research Board. Dr. Jahan leads community and facility-based MNCH programs aimed at reducing preventable illness and death. She has been honored as an ASTMH Distinguished International Fellow and selected as Gates Foundation Goalkeeper for her contributions to global health equity. It is my pleasure to invite Dr. Faiza Jahan to the stage to lead this session. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Faiza Jahan.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I don't know who sent you the notes, but you did a great job. Hello guys. How's the energy after tea? It's good? All right, so we are running about half an hour or 35 minutes late, but we're going to try to catch up in this session some of the time, and we'll try to make use of the time in the best way possible. So in this session today, where we will be talking about unexplored drivers of maternal and child health, we will have a keynote followed by a number of flash presentations. Flash presentations because this is ongoing work and the results are still pending. So it will be an opportunity for the presenters to get feedback from you. So please keep your questions ready. We are going to have only few questions. So I would request that as you hear the presentations and questions are coming up, you just immediately let us know after all the talks are done, and we're going to have a Q&A panel. It is my great honor to announce the session keynote address for this session. Dr. Farah Naz Qamar, who is a professor of pediatrics and child health at the Aga Khan University, and she's also the associate dean of research at AKU, an adjunct professor at the University of Oxford, an internationally recognized infectious disease researcher with major studies that have informed global policies, particularly in vaccination and typhoid. She and her team were the people behind Pakistan's vaccine initiation of typhoid against the extensively drug-resistant Salmonella typhi. She holds 150 publications, highly cited journals, and advises on multiple international health bodies, a strong champion for women in science, all of us, and mentoring young researchers and supporting their progress. Her contributions have also earned her several awards, both national as well as global, for her excellence in research and public health. And Dr. Farah will be speaking about pioneering research for health equity in childhood infectious diseases. Please, Dr. Farah.
Thank you, Faiza. That was a very kind introduction. I'm humbled. So I was given the task of talking about pioneering research for health equity in childhood infections. And this was slightly different topic from what we usually speak about. We generally speak about our own projects and go into the depth of those. So for this talk, in the session of maternal and child health, the way I have tried to bring it together is you will see two threads in the talk. One is, the first one I'll talk about very briefly, the persistent burden of childhood infectious diseases. And in the second part, I'll be talking about the power of locally generated data, how that transforms policy and changes outcomes. And I'll use the Pakistan typhoid experience that Faiza mentioned, that how research drives national and global policy. कीबोर्ड से भी नहीं हो रहा. Sorry about that glitch. So, despite the, it's not changing there on the screen. It's changing here on my screen. So, okay, now. So, despite the numerous advancements that science has made, infectious diseases, it's unfortunate, still remain the leading cause of child mortality. And for those of you in pediatrics, you know that pneumonia, diarrhea, malaria, they're key contributors to child health mortality. And 30% of global mortality approximately is caused by these children in low middle income countries. And the next slide that you see speaks of the areas where these mortalities are occurring. And just looking at this map, you can see the inequities. So child survival, in addition to the severity of illness, if you look at this map, you will understand that it is also very much dependent upon geography and the income status of the countries, alongside so many other factors that lead to mortality. And the majority of severe deaths you can see are happening in the poorest of the countries, sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And this is inequity. And this inequity is measurable and it is correctable by evidence-informed action. And this is another projection of the same, the relationship between wealth and poverty. And you see that children are born to the poorest household are twice as likely to die as those who are born in the wealthier families. And these are not small gradients that are visible here. These are deep structural disadvantages that these children in the poor households face. These reflect the inadequate nutrition, unsafe water, poor access to healthcare, overcrowding, and you can go on and on with the list of factors that ultimately lead to these gradients. And nowadays, a more important thing, socio-political influences. And children born in fragile and conflict-affected settings are more likely, 3 times more likely to die before reaching the age of 5. So what can research do? How can it bring about equity? So research is delivering on public health is extremely dependent on the availability of high quality data. And when it comes to generation of high quality data, and the countries that need it the most, again, we are the most disadvantaged. We do not have that quality of data and that provision for data that can inform policy in these countries. And strong public health policies rely on context-specific data. Unless we provide that information, we will continue to develop policies based on the guidance and on the data that is provided to us by the North. And we have to contribute to change this scenario. And with this, I will move on to the example of how good data can change the trajectory of a disease. And I'll talk very briefly about our typhoid surveillance. What began as a routine surveillance, very quickly it became one of Pakistan's most important public health responses. And it was entirely driven by evidence. So our existing we had existing surveillance for typhoid. It was a very small project way back in 2014. And that surveillance that we were doing at that time helped us identify from the lab a few cases of extremely drug-resistant typhoid. And very quickly, through our community surveillance, we were able to identify that these cases were occurring in clusters. It was mainly children that were affected, and it was in certain geographic areas. And so this was declared as an outbreak. And the first few isolates that we genotyped, we were able to show that this was a novel isolate. It was for the first time reported as extensively drug-resistant typhoid way back in 2017. This had never been reported in the world before, and it was resistant to all classes of antibiotic that you conventionally use for the treatment of typhoid. And this meant that this was a public health emergency and something needed to be done. So what did we do? The typhoid conjugate vaccine, fortunately, at that time in 2017, was just undergoing WHO pre-qualification. And as soon as this vaccine was pre-qualified, we brought the vaccine in and we used that for outbreak response. So in areas of Hyderabad where the outbreak primarily happened, we administered more than 200,000 doses of the vaccine. But what was important was translating this evidence into policy. This 200 doses meant nothing in the context of a country with such a huge population. So we continued to generate data as we administered that vaccine. And the data that we generated on the safety and efficacy of the vaccine showed that this vaccine was safe and it was highly efficacious. And all of these pieces of data were helpful in pushing policy. So what started as an emergency use for the vaccine as the first field implementation to combat the typhoid outbreak was soon picked up by Gavi, WHO, and other health agencies. And there was a national rollout. This vaccine came into the program, EPI program of Pakistan. It was initially launched as a campaign for children 6 months to 15 years of age. And first of all in Sindh, where the outbreak was, and 10 million doses were given in Sindh over a period of 3 weeks. And this indeed was a huge success for us. And then this was introduced into the routine EPI program of Pakistan in January of 2020. So this marked a huge success where TCV integration into the national immunization took place. And Pakistan was one of the first countries that introduced this vaccine based on our data into its routine immunization program. But we did not stop here. We continued our surveillance. The vaccine was introduced in 2020. We continued to collect data on what's going on after the introduction of the vaccine. We continued our hybrid surveillance together with healthcare seeking, lab surveillance, and as well as hospital surveillance, and expanded our surveillance from Sindh to all major cities of the country. And this, in the long run, after 5 years, when we have analyzed the data, it showed signals. It showed a shifting epidemiology. We were able to show that the group where the vaccine was administered, in the children less than 2 years particularly, there was a significant reduction in disease burden. But the age epidemiology had shifted, and now there is more disease and more disease burden in the older age group, who are the non-vaccine eligible age group, more than 15 years of age. And secondly, we also saw a rise in paratyphy. So these two very important things, together with the persistence of the XDR typhoid, we did not see a huge reduction in the XDR prevalence. It continued to be the same, though there was a little reduction. It would be wrong to say that there was no absolute reduction. Proportions did go down. And all of this evidence from Pakistan was very important and contributed significantly to the WHO SAGE review discussions, because this data that we collected was the first large-scale real-world programmatic evidence of the typhoid conjugate vaccine. And these insights helped in shaping global recommendations, including considerations of a booster dose for a high-burden country like Pakistan. Not only shaping the SAGE recommendation, the data generated from Pakistan, I can proudly say that this has now led to the introduction of this vaccine in 11 high-burden countries. And rollout is ongoing, and by the end of this year, almost 120 million children will have received this vaccine. So it's a huge success for starting from Pakistan, which became the first introducer, and then this was followed by other countries. So what are the lessons that in health equity that we learned from this? Number one, local data corrects the blind spots. When you generate your own data and you analyze your own data, you shine light on the communities and the children and the diseases that need the most attention. And national and global decisions improve when your evidence comes from the communities carrying the highest disease burden. Research capacity is equity. When local labs, data systems, and researchers are empowered, children in high burden settings benefit from faster and more appropriate responses. And sustained surveillance protects gains. Equity is not a one-time achievement. Policy shifts when evidence is persistent. And in the context of vaccine, we have seen that for numerous other diseases, such as pneumococcal, there are shifts in serotypes, there may be shifts in age groups, and there may be waning immunity, and all of those need to be continuously followed to be able to inform global policy. So I would say evidence and data helps to save lives, but generating strong evidence requires strong teams. But globally, women still face barriers that limit their participation in science. And this is not just for Pakistan, it is a global issue that women all over in science face gender bias, unequal pay, and fewer leadership opportunities and limited research funding. Although globally there is a lot of work and effort that is going on to reduce these gaps, but these gaps persist, and more so in low middle income countries. In addition to those global challenges, women everywhere in the world face the challenge of maintaining the balance. And so many women, a room hall full of women, nobody can understand this better. We are all juggling between our family responsibilities and career advancement. And it is not an easy job. We have all gone through this. And the two things that help you go through this journey are resilience and hard work. There is no substitute to these two things. And with these two factors, resilience and hard work, there are many Pakistani women who have broken barriers in global health. And all of these women are pushing boundaries and have leadership roles in healthcare. And at this point, I think I would pause and take a minute to appreciate the ecosystem and the platform that AKU provides us. Because without this platform, I would not have been where I'm standing today. I think AKU provides us the global training, the research opportunities, infrastructure, mentorship, and most of all, there are robust policies that ensure safety, respect, and dignity. It provides an environment where women can work safely and lead from the front. So leading without fear is one thing that AKU gives us and teaches us, and we need more environments like this to sustain and empower global leaders like yourselves sitting in this room. And as we move into the future, we need more programs like the one that you are a part of, the Women in Science program. We need to train women leaders to champion the health. If we want equity in outcome, we should have equity in opportunities. Health equity demands gender equity in science. And as our provost, I don't know how many of you were there yesterday, as our provost mentioned yesterday, mentorship amplifies impact. And one woman's success becomes the success of many. And in the end, I would say, believe in yourself. When you shift your mindset from a mindset of limitations to a mindset of possibilities, you stop waiting for opportunities and you start building your own. And that shift in your mindset is transformative. Continue to invest in yourself, whatever stage of career you are. And every investment you make in yourself becomes an investment in the communities that you serve and the young scientists who will follow your path. And with that, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Farah, for that really inspiring keynote. I have a question, but I'll hold it till the end of the session. So now we will move into the flash presentation phase of the session. I would like to invite Dr. Gulalai Rahman. Dr. Gulalai is Director Public Health, Department of Balochistan, and she's HOD at FNSD, Arya Institute of Health Sciences. Obviously, she is a Swiss fellow for cohort 2. And her background is in medicine, a Master's of Sciences in Community Health and Nutrition, MSPH. She is also a food scholar a PhD scholar in food and nutrition, and serves as the Director of Public Health in the Health Department of Balochistan. Her work focuses on adolescent nutrition, public health systems, and improving provincial health outcomes. And Dr. Gulalai will speak about micronutrients. Very welcome. Dr. Gulalai, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. First, I would like to extend my gratitude to the AKUH and IGHD because I was having the qualification, but this exponential growth which I have experienced is only after I have joined this program. I don't know whether it was coincidence or they noticed this interscale fellowship with AKUH and Oxford. So first, the Arya Institute of Medical Sciences hired me as a director of FNSD, and then the government approached me as a deputy director nutrition in the nutrition program, and then they make me the director of public health at provincial level. So I have worked tirelessly in these positions. So the credit goes to, I think, the team of IGHD, and I am lucky that my mentor is today in front of me. And studying at the older age, you got the benefit that my mentor is like younger than me. So let's start today's presentation. And the micronutrient status and the malnutrition risk factor among the adolescent girls of the district Pasheen. Background is that, as you all know, that adolescence is a vulnerable phase, and we call it as the second window of opportunity after the first 1,000 years, 1,000 days at the infancy. So if a child left behind in the first 1,000 days, we have the second opportunity of the adolescence. And I think in our setup until 2019, we were not having any policy for the adolescents. So despite the fact that we are having 40 million adolescents in the Pakistan, and it is of makes 23% of the population. So, adolescents anemia reaches 73.4% in the Balochistan. And nationally, it is a bit less, like 60 to 66%. And we are having limited district level micronutrient data available for not only for Pasheen, but obviously for all the districts due to the fact that doing household survey is a laborious work, and micronutrient status, determining micronutrient status is a bit expensive for the government also and for the developing countries like us. But the fact is, without evidence generation and without concrete evidence, you can't make the policies. And then your policies would be like andhere mein teer chalana. So the study objective was to assess the micronutrient status of the hemoglobin, vitamin D, zinc, and identify the risk factor associated with malnutrition, and provide evidence for the provincial nutrition policy and programming. So although it seems a very simple study, cross-sectional study on here, but when we were working in the field, it was like not an uphill task, but up mountain task. Dr. Jain knows it very well that we come across many hurdles because the population in the Balochistan is different. The terrain is different. The terrain is difficult. So we have come across very much difficulties and hurdles. But I am blessed that I was having by my side Dr. Jay and my colleague Mushtaq Mirani Saab. So he paved these ways for me with convenience. So the data analysis until now is not being done. Only we have few descriptive analysis, and inshallah we will do it and will produce some good work with the associated factors of the malnutrition, and the work is like underway. So what we have found that what was the different was the hemoglobin status. If you appreciate that our most of our population was having the normal HB status, and only 9% were iron deficient. So it was like different from the National Nutrition Survey, which shows that 73% of our population is having iron deficiency anemia. But in our cohort, it comes as 9%. So here, then the question arises that whether if we are using the blanket approach of the iron folic acid level and we are giving to whole of the adolescents girls, so then the question arises, and then if I say that the policy must be backed by the strong evidence, then here it comes.
So,
And
Dr.
as-
Gulalai, your
Yeah.
5 minutes are up, but I'm going to let you continue, but please wrap it up.
Okay, okay. So the zinc status was like 32% of our population was deficient. And as for the vitamin D, 74% of our population was deficient in the vitamin D. So these were the preliminary findings, and recommendations are the vitamin D supplementation and national food fortifications, zinc-rich food. But this is like very early for the recommendation as our work is underway. So we are hopeful that we will produce good work with the support of the AKU and IGHD team. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gulalai. So our next presenter, my papers are all over the place. Our next presenter is Dr. Hamna Khan, who has completed her MBBS from Nishtar Medical College and then FCPS in Community Medicine. She currently serves as an assistant professor at Nishtar Medical University, and her work focuses on maternal mental health, public health research, and improving the community-based healthcare delivery. She is a supporting Women in Science fellow for cohort 2 and will be speaking about postpartum depression. Very welcome, Dr. Hamna. Dr. Hamna, you have 5 minutes, and at 4 minutes, I'm just going to show this sign. Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm Dr. Hamna, and the topic of my project is postpartum depression, its risk factors and interventions for its prevention. It's basically a systematic review and meta-analysis. As we all know, motherhood is a transformative experience, often accompanied by immense joy, but also significant challenges. The transition, hormonal shifts, and new responsibilities can lead to complex emotional landscapes. Postpartum depression is a serious mental health condition affecting women after childbirth, characterized by persistent sadness, anxiety, and fatigue. Postpartum depression prevalence varies globally, ranging from 5% to 26.3%. Developing countries are reporting high rates. Postpartum depression does not affect the women only, it affects maternal well-being as well as the child development. They affect the cognitive development of child, their emotional regulation, and it can potentially lead to long-term issues. It also affects the partner relationships, and if left unrecognized and untreated, it can initiate a cycle of mental health challenges. My research objectives are to identify and analyze the significant risk factors that are associated with postpartum depression, to evaluate and synthesize the evidence on interventions effective in preventing postpartum depression. As for methodology, the research questions that we framed were what risk factors are associated with postpartum depression and what interventions can effectively prevent postpartum depression. As for study design, it's a systematic review and meta-analysis. We used a PICO framework to frame our question, and our outcome of interest is prevention of postpartum depression. We are using a comprehensive search strategy. It's a 3-stage search strategy. Initially, we will be searching on PubMed, Google Scholar, and PsycInfo. And stage 2 will be extensive search, and stage 3 will be reference list mining. Search terms like postpartum depression, risk factors, and prevention interventions will be used, and articles that are published within the last 10 years in English language will be included. 2 independent reviewers will review the articles. And for data analysis plan, effect sizes will be extracted and pooled using a random effect model. Heterogeneity will be assessed using the I2 statistics, and subgroup and sensitivity analysis will be performed. We will plot funnels plot, and we will perform Egger's test to see the publication bias. And analysis and reporting will be performed following PRISMA guidelines using RevMan and R software. The results that we are expecting are the identification of key risk factors that are associated with postpartum depression. We are looking forward to summarize some effective preventive interventions across global studies, and we are looking forward for the evidence-based recommendations for maternal health programs, and we will highlight the research gaps to guide further studies. Postpartum depression remains a major yet under-recognized public health issue, especially in developing countries. And the previous studies, they highlight the multifactorial causes, including hormonal, social, and psychological factors. Preventive interventions such as education, counseling, and home visits have shown promising results, according to the previous studies. Strengthening awareness, screening, and early intervention program is crucial to reduce its global burden. These are my references, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hamna, for keeping in record time, actually. Less than 4 minutes. Our next speaker is Dr. Meher Masood. Dr. Meher Masood is a senior registrar at the Department of Gynecology and Obstetrics at the Jinnah Postgraduate Medical Center. And her interest is in advancing clinical research. Her work focuses on maternal cardiovascular health, strengthening multidisciplinary care models, and improving outcomes for high-risk pregnancies. Today, she will be speaking on her project, which is evaluation of effectiveness of joint cardio-obstetric care in managing cardiac diseases in pregnancy. Welcome, Dr. Hamna. Dr. Meher.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the Global Health and IGHD for giving me a chance to enhance my skills in the research department. My topic, as you have already discussed, it is the evaluation of effectiveness of joint cardio-ops team in managing cardiac diseases in pregnancy.
Yeah, let's see. I think your presentation is not coming up. Can you please make sure that it is projecting?
It's going on. Done? Okay. So, the background: cardiac diseases during pregnancy are associated with the higher risk of maternal and fetal morbidity and mortality. Traditional model of care falls short in addressing the complexity of these cases. Evidence of the global literature supports the role of multidisciplinary collaboration, especially joint cardio-ops team in optimizing maternal and neonatal outcomes. But there is a gap in localized evidence regarding the real-world effectiveness of such models in LMIC and middle-income countries. This study aims to assess the effectiveness of joint cardio-ops team at Jinnah Postgraduate Medical Center, Karachi, in improving outcomes for pregnant women with cardiac conditions. The planned sample size of the study was 500 women, but due to the limited number of patients presenting within this time frame, 400 patients were included. Methods. The data has been collected through the structured questionnaire and review of patients' medical record during antenatal visits at the time of delivery. The variables which were collected include socio-demographic characteristics, the cardiac history, the ops history, antenatal care details, quality of care parameters, maternal and neonatal outcome. And then statistical analysis were performed in SPSS, which incorporates descriptive statistics summarizing the key study variable, multivariable analysis to explore associations and adjusting the potential confounders. This is the table which shows the descriptive characteristics of the enrolled women in my study, including socio-demographics, medical, surgical, and obstetric history, and care offered, and the cardiac disease and care offered to them. In table 2, there are predictors of adverse maternal outcomes, and table 3 shows the predictors of adverse birth outcomes. So when we conclude, the characteristics of all the enrolled women were summarized in table 1. The mean age of the participants was 28.76. 8.3% had no formal education. Half, 58.8%, had household monthly income of Pak rupees 75,000 and above. Cardiomyopathy was the most common cardiac disorder, followed by the congenital heart disease, 26.3%. and VSD 15.8%. More than half, 53.9%, were classified as high-risk NYHA category. The most common comorbids were diabetes, which were 21%, and hypertension, 16.5%. Now, the frequencies of adverse pregnancy and birth outcomes were 4.8% patients died, while 15.3% had a stillbirth, and more than 1/4, 27.3%, experienced other pregnancy complications. And almost half had low birth weight, and there was a significant chunk experiencing preterm birth due to the conditions. Table 2 and 3 summarizes the difference in adverse pregnancy and birth outcomes between different groups. Patients of cardiomyopathy show significantly high maternal mortality, arrhythmia, preterm birth, low APGAR score. High-risk NYHA class showed high maternal mortality, heart failure, arrhythmia. Patients who were seen by the cardio-ops team 2 times or more had significant lower chances of maternal mortality, heart failure, arrhythmias, preterm birth, stillbirth, and other adverse pregnancy, other maternal and fetal adverse outcomes. And advanced maternal age of 35 or more showed higher maternal mortality. Women having no formal education have significantly higher preterm stillbirth and lower APGAR scores. So the results are pointing towards an effectiveness of this joint cardio-ops team, and the final results and analysis is going on, and we'll be expecting to have a concrete evidence regarding it. In the end, I would like to thank my mentor, Dr. Zulfikar Ali Bhutta, the IGHT team, and for supporting me, and my HOD, my leader, Dr. Nigat Ali Shah. She has always been kind to me for giving, and all my other fellows, colleagues who have worked with me, Mr. Tariq, Dr. Aisha, and Dr. Maimuna. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Meher, for this really important work. Our last but not the least, final speaker for today is Professor Nigat Shah. Professor Nigat Shah actually needs no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyways. She is the Pro Vice Chancellor at the Jinnah Sindh Medical University, Karachi, and founding head of the Shrini Bhutta Center of Excellence for Women and Child Health at the Jinnah Postgraduate Medical Center. She is, her vision focuses on excellence in education,
That's okay, Dr. Faiza.
promotion
That's
of research, community-oriented health services,
That's okay. That's okay.
and
Thank you.
importantly,
Thank you.
she's a prolific consultant in obstetrics and
Thank
gynecology, also serving at the Aga Khan University Hospital. Dr.
Thank
Niket, I'm going to take my 30 seconds, okay?
Thank you very much.
Well,
Thank you. I'm really thankful to IGHT team, to Aga Khan University, to Dr. Zulfikar Bhutta, who's my mentor, for giving us this opportunity to take part in this amazing, amazing work. And my work is focused around the passion which we all have, all people working in OBGYN, all people looking after mothers, have this passion of saving mothers, that there should be no maternal death in Pakistan. And that I took up as a challenge. And what actually this challenge means is that we are looking at mothers who we have been able to save as compared to mothers who died with the same condition, say eclampsia, sepsis, or PPH. Why did one mother die at the same time the other survived? So we are trying to look at all that. So I work in Professor Shireen Bhutta Center of Excellence, and this is just 3 years old, people. So this center was formed by USAID in 2013, but it was lying vacant, this whole beautiful tower, because of the conflict between the federal and provincial whatever, कि ये किसका है, and then it was given to me by the Minister Saiba, and then with my amazing, amazing team, who I'll call here in the moment, because they are the workers on the ground, and they do things and we take credit. So there's no conflict of interest. This is one of our favorite pictures. This is my signature picture of the ward. You can see the greenery there. You can see the beautiful environment and my beautiful girls. So this Shireen Bhutta Center of Excellence is only for Smile. There is no cash counter. We don't charge anything. We do it everything for love and to spread the goodness and wellness. The first baby born there in our center was named as Shireen. So, yeah. So the context is that we already know that although there has been some progress in reducing maternal mortality in last 2 decades, however, it still lagged behind its neighboring countries like Bangladesh and India, mostly because of family planning. And one of our main area where we are working is universal family planning. And yet, just yesterday, we had 100% family planning in 9B unit. So I think that calls for applause. The 3 leading causes we know are hemorrhage, sepsis, and eclampsia, but cardiac diseases are very fast taking up, and I'm thankful to Meher for making my job easier and bringing that up, because we have set up a cardio ops clinic. The chances of survival in these complications are determined by well-known delays and the socio-economic condition. कितनी poor है patient, कितनी पढ़ी लिखी है, पहुंच पाती है, शहर की है, गांव की है. इसलिए study में urban areas के साथ-साथ rural areas भी हैं. It's a multi-centered study. So literature on audit of severe maternal outcomes in Pakistan is scarce, with only few single-center studies. This study is multi-centered. और इसमें इतने लोगों ने interest किया कि मुझे लाड़काना से phone आए कि आपने मेरा unit क्यों नहीं लिया? मैंने कहा मेरे पास पैसे नहीं है, तो कहने लगी बगैर पैसे के हम आ जाएंगे. So people are there to work. It's not the money, and money should never be a barrier. Such studies help in quantifying the severe maternal outcomes ratio and identify the need for health system resources to deal with these emergencies. So the study objectives were to estimate the burden of severe maternal outcomes, both near miss and maternal deaths in public setup, and to determine the main causes of severe maternal outcomes. वो main causes हम सबको पता है, and we know they have remedy, but still we are falling short. Where we are falling short, I aim to take that up in this audit, to compare the socio-demographic and clinical characteristics between near misses and maternal deaths. So this was a prospective surveillance study still ongoing. 11 units and 5 tertiary care, 2 Karachi में हैं, हैदराबाद के 3 units हैं हमारे पास, I think नवाबशाह के 2 units हैं और लाड़काना के 3 units हैं. All women meeting the criteria of severe maternal outcome, near misses and maternal deaths. May to December, 8 months, and I'll request my mentor कि हमें time बढ़ा दें ताकि हमारे statistically significant results आए. Study हो तो अच्छी हो सर, वरना तो फिर ऐसी आधी सादी तो करने का फायदा नहीं है. So a structured questionnaire adapted from WHO near-miss tool and international guidelines on maternal audit gathering, information gathering was uptaken. Socio-demographic, obstetric history, causes of near-misses and maternal mortality, and data related to 3 delays. So बहुत comprehensive form था. I did not want to overload you, जो कि already overloaded है. So resident in each units were trained. We called them up and we trained them at 9B. Data was filled in on Google Forms, entered in Karachi concurrently and SPSS, and data quality checked for completeness. ये regularly हर week पे load होती हैं. Ethical considerations were all met. This is the training of the girls. This is my research assistant, Dr. Shiraz from AIPH. He's very active and he's the one who takes care of day in and day out smaller details of this study. These are the units and hospitals. उसमें ओजा भी है, civil hospital भी है, लियाकत भी है, जो कि हैदराबाद वाला है. So सारे public setups हैं, because people, why public setups? Because those are, unfortunately, forgive me for using crude word, they are the dumping ground. कि जब patient का कहीं छोटे छोटे centers में पैसे खत्म हो जाते हैं तो कहते हैं जिना चले जाओ, civil चले जाओ, and they come in gasping condition, they come in terrible condition. So इसलिए maternal mortality का huge data हम अपने कंधों पे लेके फिर रहे हैं, और अगर उसका audit नहीं किया और उस पर policy नहीं बनी तो फिर उसका कोई फ़ायदा नहीं है. 20 साल से जो हो रहा है अगले 40 साल में भी वही होगा. So ये कुछ डेफिनेशन है. नियर मिस वो पेशेंट होती है जो अल्लाह मियाँ से हाथ मिला के वापस आए, जो कि आईसीयू में गई है, वेंटिलेटर पे गई है. और इसमें एक हमारी कार्डियक पेशेंट आईसीयू में गई, वेंटिलेटर पे गई, ठीक हो गई, घर गई, फिर 3 महीने में प्रेग्नेंट होके आ गई. अब तो मैं लड़कियों को कहा है कि हर हाल में आपने उसका कॉन्ट्रासेप्शन करना है, चाहे जडेल डालो, IUCD डालो, कुछ भी डालो, एंड गवर्नमेंट गिव्स अस फ्री ऑफ कॉस्ट. ये सारा हमारे पास अवेलेबल है, बहुत ज़्यादा तादाद में अवेलेबल है, एंड गर्ल्स आर ट्रेंड फॉर दैट. And maternal death, you all know कि it's death of a pregnant mother within 42 days. And severe maternal outcomes दोनों को ऐड करते हैं. ये कुछ डेटा है हमारा जो नियर मिस भी दिखा रहा है, maternal death, इनको ऐड करते हैं तो severe maternal outcomes है. फिर total cases हैं और उसका percentage निकालते हैं तो जो 6 और 5% आती हैं. So compare it to the countries like even Bangladesh जिनका 3% से भी कम है. हमारा, अगर मैंने अभी 3 दिन पहले मैटरनल मोर्टेलिटी टास्क फोर्स में प्रेजेंट किया था सिंध गवर्नमेंट को, तो 3 महीने का 88 द एक्चुअल नंबर्स, जहाँ के 2-2.5 हज़ार डिलीवरी थी, 88 डेथ थी और 1300 एंड समथिंग आपका मैटरनल मोर्टेलिटी रेट निकल रहा था, जो ओवर 100,000 होता है. दैट इज़ वेरी हाई. वाई? बिकॉज WHO सेज जहाँ 1000 से ज़्यादा हो वहाँ कोई केयर नहीं है. और हमारा इतना बड़ा सेटअप है, 60 मेरी डॉक्टर्स हैं, वो सब मेरी डॉक्टर्स बैठी हुई हैं, खड़ी हो जाएं जो भी 9B की जितनी डॉक्टर्स खड़ी हैं, ये सब ग्राउंड फ्लोर पे हमेशा मौजूद होती हैं. दीज आर द गर्ल्स हु वर्क इन स्ट्रेचर, लेके भागती हैं और जान बचाने की कोशिश करती हैं, फिर भी नहीं बचा पाते हैं. तो आप लोग से पेरिफ्रीज में जो भी लोग काम करते हैं, गुजारिश है कि ज़िंदा पेशेंट ले आएँ तो इंशाल्लाह ज़िंदा बच जाएगी. बिकॉज प्रेगनेंसी इज़ नॉट एन इलनेस, इट्स नॉट एन पैथोलॉजी. अ वुमन शुड नॉट डाई. और जो मैडम अब SICH और ये वो सब बना रही हैं बच्चों के लिए, नियोनेटोलॉजी के लिए, मैं कहती हूँ मदर इज़ द बेस्ट इंक्यूबेटर. माँ बचा लें, बच्चा नहीं मरेगा. सो सॉरी टू अ पीडियाट्रिशियन, बट माँ बचाएं, बच्चा नहीं मरेगा. सो ये मेरा छोटा सा वो है. कॉजेज़ आपको पता है, सिवियर क्लिम्सिया बहुत ज़्यादा है. इट्स ओवरटेकिंग PPH, इट्स ओवरटेकिंग सेप्सिस, इट्स ओवरटेकिंग एवरीथिंग. लेकिन हमारे हॉस्पिटल में सेप्सिस भी बहुत ज़्यादा है. हर औरत का पस निकल रहा होता है, इन लड़कियों को पता है. सुबह शाम ड्रेसिंगें कर रही होती हैं, दुआएं पढ़ के फूंक रही होती हैं, कोई ठीक हो जाए, ये हो जाए. हर एंटीबायोटिक्स, वैनकोमाइसिन और मीरो तो ऐसे जैसे पानी की तरह चलता है. स्टिल द वुमेन डोंट कम आउट ऑफ इट, एंड कार्डियक डिजीज़ आर रैपिडली कैचिंग अप. सो ये प्रोजेक्ट टाइमलाइन है. इंशाल्लाह फरवरी में आप 6 मिनट दे देंगी तो मैं और ज़्यादा अच्छा इसको प्रेजेंट कर दूंगी.
डॉक्टर नेगल, आपका टाइम अप हो गया.
हाँ, वही मैं कहने वाली थी कि मेरा ये भी टाइम हो गया. सिर्फ मैं एक छोटी सी 1 मिनट की वीडियो है. ये मैटरनल मोर्टेलिटी टास्क फोर्स बनी है जिसको मैडम हेड कर रही हैं. तो मैं चाह रही हूँ कि आप लोग समझें कि सिंध गवर्नमेंट का पैशन यहाँ पर है. हम लोग are very easy, we talk against the government, but this government, this madam sitting there is very much enthusiastic for mothers. And ये सिर्फ थोड़ी सी आप देख लें क्योंकि हमने इसमें बहुत MOU साइन किए हैं, and because of her passion. ये NICVD से है हमारा MOU, सिंध के NICVD से भी है, SICVD से. in the interest of time. So, जितने भी इंटीरियर के कोलीग्स हैं सब आते हैं, हर मीटिंग पे आते हैं. टास्क फोर्स बन चुका है मैटरनल मोर्टेलिटी, और ये वाली स्टडी इंशाल्लाह पॉलिसी गाइड करेगी. इसलिए डॉक्टर भुट्टा आपने स्टडी को चलाना है, 8 महीने में ख़त्म नहीं करना है. थैंक यू वेरी मच.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nigat. So really, like a couple of takeaways that I have from this is that talent is quite universal. And probably opportunity is not. And therefore, I'm so glad that the Women in Science Forum is actually addressing not the talent issue, but the opportunity issue. There are very rare instances globally as well as nationally for these kind of opportunities. But I just want to say to all the fellows that the footstool of any development actually is an abundance mindset. You should never think that there are not enough opportunities. Grab the opportunities that you can get, seek for the opportunities, and make the best of the opportunities that you have. So with that, I would like to invite the speakers to the podium, because I think that was my instruction, for some questions and answers. And we have about 5 minutes for that. Of course, of course.
So it's one advantage of sitting in the front that you can get to ask questions.
It's also an advantage of being the director of the IGHT.
Yeah, well, so I had a question of, I'm just trying to locate, was that the Gulale Rahman from Quetta on this? So look, iron status tracks very closely with zinc status. So if you have a prevalence of zinc deficiency of around 30%, there is just no way that you can have normal iron status unless you're dealing with a very special population. So could you say a word or two about your methodology? What kind of assessments for anemia, particularly iron deficiency anemia, did you undertake in this population? But certainly for Balochistan, to say there is absolutely no, there are other micronutrient deficiencies, but somehow the other iron is absent. You're either dealing with a population which is very different in terms of maybe their hemoglobin, hemoglobinopathies, or that there is a methodological issue. So that's my one question. I have a comment. Can I finish and then I'm done? So Nigat, first of all, there was a reason why I encouraged you to do this study, because I think there are very few people who can organize a multi-center study of risk factors for maternal mortality, and you've done a great job. So I think obviously, with the delays and all that have been with the project, we should look at what is the optimal sample size that we need to get to that effect. So it's not an ad hoc decision. It's a decision that should be based on power calculation, and also what is the background rate that you're getting. So I think that's a scientific discussion that you should have within the program. I'm happy to chip in and see what needs to be done, but we should stick to the original hypothetical power calculation as to what sample you needed. And if you're not able to do it in a particular period of time, then that time can be expanded. Okay?
Thank you, Dr. Bhutta. Dr. Guralai, you would like to respond?
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir, for this question. It's like a very important question. As far as my perspective, it is only my opinion. So first of all, we took the data from the Pashin. And Pashin is a bit different from whole of the Balochistan in terms of literacy rate. We are having some areas where the literacy is like 100% declared in 1980. In 90, yeah.
Hemoglobin estimation.
It was
and iron deficiency estimation.
yeah, it was like CBC. We have done CBC.
Also, you have done but using what method?
The method
Is it
was
a
yeah.
Sali hemoglobinometer?
No, not no.
Coulter.
No,
Coulter counter?
no. It was in the lab. It was in
So
the
it must
lab,
have been
yeah.
a Coulter.
And there might be one more reason.
Hemoglobins then.
No, not only hemoglobin. It was like whole CBC.
No, but it wouldn't have ferritin, right? Did you have any
No,
ferritin
no,
that you
not ferritin, yeah.
So let's not discuss this too much here, but let's see your data.
No,
and
no.
give you some
One
advice.
thing.
माइक्रोसिटिक था सीबीसी में?
Until it is only the frequency. So it needs to be like analyzed now. We didn't done the whole work yet.
मेरा आपको कहने को मौत दबाना मकसद सिर्फ
जी।
ये है इससे पहले कि आप गवर्नमेंट ऑफ बलूचिस्तान कहें कि एनीमिया पब्लिक हेल्थ प्रॉब्लम नहीं है, जरा इस डेटा को अच्छी तरह देख लीजिए।
Yeah, बिल्कुल।
और हम टेक्निकली
अभी
आपको
तक
हेल्प
इसको-
करने के लिए तैयार
जी।
हैं, बिकॉज सिर्फ एक सीवीसी पे हम आयरन डिफिशिएंसी एनीमिया डिटेक्ट नहीं करते। इसी वास्ते सारी दुनिया में एक तरीका है करने का जिसमें फेरेटिन मेजर करके आयरन डिफिशिएंसी एनीमिया एस्टिमेट किया जाता है। तो अगर आपने ये कूल्टर काउंटर पे भी किए हैं सारे, तो उन कूल्टर काउंटर्स की कैलिब्रेशन, एक्सटर्नल वैलिडिटी, सारी ये चीज़ें ज़रूरी होती हैं। तो लेट्स टॉक एंड सी हाउ वी कैन हेल्प यू, बिकॉज वी गॉट जिंक स्टेटस देयर। 30% zinc deficiency is above the national average.
Yeah, it is like
National average
23%
is around 20%.
23%, yeah.
NNS.
Yeah.
So अगर इतनी zinc deficiency है तो
सर उसकी एक वजह हो सकती है, उसकी ये है कि वो जो मैंने आपको कहा ना कि हम ब्लैंकेट अप्रोच यूज़ कर रहे हैं फॉर आयरन फॉलिक एसिड, बट देयर इज़ नो सच प्रोग्राम फॉर जिंक, सो दैट माइट बी अ रीज़न.
So my advice to you, Dr. Gulalai, is
Yeah.
look at some of the explanatory variables. एक तो कि पहले तो आप अपना data check करें.
Yeah.
9% anemia, you know, even if it's just hemoglobin, is quite difficult to digest in our population, given that, you know, our national rates as well as our provincial rates are very different. So even if this is a forward area of Balochistan, I think do look at the socioeconomic factors to back that claim, and
Yeah.
also review your study methodology. Is it random? You know, what is the distribution of the BMI of the population that you have sampled, and
Yeah.
other such things. All right,
Yeah,
so I'm going
because
to
it's
move on
underway. Yeah, yeah.
because there's audience. So it was a comment.
It was a comment, but I just want to say कि जो मैंने last discussion की अपना statistical person से, he said कि probably results statistically significant नहीं होंगे अगर हमारा sample size 1000 के round. These are severe maternal outcomes, not the total deliveries. Total deliveries will go up to 10,000, लेकिन जो sample जो severe maternal outcomes का होगा वो 1000 तक होगा. तो अगर हमें कोई डिफरेंस या कोई स्टेटिस्टिकली सिग्निफिकेंट चीज़ चाहिए तो ही सेट फिर आप थोड़ा सा 1.5 साल 2 साल तक सोचें. सो इन एनी केस आई टॉक टू यू अबाउट दैट. हम लोग बात कर लेंगे.
All right. Any question from the audience? Please introduce yourself first.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the great ladies over here. My name is Professor Dr. Saima Salim. I am from Dr. A.Q. Khan Institute of Biotechnology and Genetic Engineering, University of Karachi, and also the Secretary of Overseas Women Foundation, which has been running from Italy, Trieste. My question to all the lovely ladies, especially Dr. Naz, that you have given us such a motivational talk. I would like to know that what are your suggestions for us and all the young girls sitting over here, that how can we maintain the resilience and how can we deal the rejections which are coming in our way in every field? Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent question. So persistence is something, and one thing that I have always relied on is faith. Whatever rejection, whatever difficult times come your way, they will pass. Continue to focus on your goal and continue to work hard and seize whatever opportunities that come your way. That is the brief answer that I can give you.
फेलियर इज़ पार्ट ऑफ सक्सेस. गिरते हैं शहसवारी मैदान जंग में. मैदान जंग में होना ज़रूरी है. तो ठीक है, गिरने से और ज़्यादा स्ट्रांग हो जाएंगे. इट्स स्ट्रेंथ, गिरना तो चाहिए.
One thing which I would like to add on is stopping a thing is failing a thing. Once you go on persistently doing a thing, do it for few days but do it persistently. Then I think you will do something. You will end up doing something. Yes, believing in ourselves, not thinking that I cannot do it. Everything is possible. Yes.
And I would like to say that life is a package. You can't take only good. You have to confront the bad and the hurdles, and it will give you energy. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Farah, I had a question from you, and that's actually related to this equity issue that you presented in the context of typhoid. I mean, I want to know that were there any pockets of low vaccine uptake in this rollout, and how that was, how do you think that contributed to the equity or the inequity? Because we do see this with a lot of other vaccines.
Yes. So, great question. So, Pfizer, there were pockets of this. First of all, I would say that this was one of the campaigns that was very, very well planned by the government, because this was the first time that this campaign was being conducted where adolescent girls were being involved, and a lot of thought needed to go into reducing the hesitancy around vaccinating adolescent girls. So, many of the questions like vaccinators. So a lot of female vaccinators were hired for this purpose to reduce, to improve the coverage. Then again, the issue of full sleeves and half sleeves and having a room where these girls could be vaccinated. Then counseling and timing where of the vaccination when the parents come to pick up the children in school, timing of all of that. And lastly, the issue of out-of-school children. Because yesterday you saw in Dr. Anjum Halai's presentation that so many boys and girls are out of school. How to handle that? So this was a very, very well-planned campaign, and all of those issues were taken care of. But despite that, there were pockets that were resistant to vaccination, like there are for all other vaccines. And I think those, marking those and identifying those was the first step. The campaign eventually was over in 3 weeks' time. But those pockets that were marked, I think those were similar to many of the other vaccine campaigns where they were not different from other vaccines. And they were taken care of in the future campaigns for other vaccines that were planned later on. And the MR vaccine was later on planned immediately a couple of months following this, because COVID hit immediately after this campaign. 2020 and 2021 were very difficult times. And then when the MR campaign was planned, and then these cohorts were taken care of.
Okay, with that, we're going to conclude this session. Thank you very much to all the speakers. Thank you, guys.
Now, I would request our chair, Dr. Faiza Jahan, and Dr. Farah Naz Qamar to present the mementos to our fellows. And also, I would request Dr. Zulfikar Bhutta to please present the mementos.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now,
अब आप अनाउंस करें फेलोज के साथ एक ग्रुप फोटो सर का.
can we have a picture with all the fellows? Okay.
Just one photo with all the fellows, I think. Fellows जो के speakers हैं आज के the researchers, because we feel that they should have done.
Kindly join in for the picture.
Anyway,
Please do it quickly. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Faiza Jahan, for leading session C. We now move to session D, titled Adolescent Health and Environment Risk. This session will be chaired by Dr. Rosina Karmaliani. Dr. Rosina Karmaliani is an implementation scientist and associate director at AKU's Rain and Mind Institute, leading work across South and Central Asia. She was the first Pakistani to earn a PhD in nursing from University of Minnesota and previously served as Dean of AKU's School of Nursing and Midwifery. Her research focuses on women, child and adolescent health, gender-based violence prevention, and mental health systems. She has contributed to advancing nursing education in Pakistan, East Africa, Afghanistan, Syria, and Egypt. Dr. Karmaliani has received multiple honors, including WHO's Global 100 Nurse and Midwife Leaders recognition and induction into the American Academy of Nursing. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Rosina Karmaliani to the stage to chair this session.
Thank you so much for your generous introduction. I'll just quickly move on to our keynote speaker, as we are about an hour delay, so we promise you lunch and hopefully 12:45 for lunch break, and we will cover up the time. So after the lunch, you'll have like 15 minutes delay compared to the 1 hour delay. So I'll try my best. So with that, I would like to invite a great scientist at AKU and my dear friend and colleague, Professor Dr. Zahra Hassan. Professor Dr. Zahra Hassan is the Ghulam Ali Hirji Endowed Professor in Pathology and Laboratory Medicine at Aga Khan University. She is also the Director of the Faculty of Health Sciences at the PhD program. She holds a PhD from Imperial College. We all know her work, mostly who are at AKU, from her COVID-19 vaccine work, which was nationally recognized, and her infectious disease work. So without taking a lot of time, you can read about her outside and in the program as well. Over to you, Dr. Zahra.
Thank you, Rosina. And Assalamu alaikum, everyone. First of all, I must applaud Dr. Bhutta and Dr. Jai and AHT for putting together this fantastic program. There's been mention of women in science and difficulties that they've had, how we must strive as science, we must strive in research. And my disclaimer is that I believe, looking back, I was brought up as a child and not a girl, and that I trained at Imperial College in a predominantly male laboratory. I worked in my postdoc in a predominantly male environment, and now I have a predominantly female department, but my team has both females and males, and I'm happy that they are here. And so my work has not focused on a female lens, but I'll tell you something interestingly enough that did pop up in some of our COVID research work. So I was given this title, which was Infectious Diseases Research in Terms of Policy. And I mean, that's not an area that my work has really focused on. But when we think about infections and the importance of understanding infections, we must think of all the diseases that have really formed the global populations, old world diseases like tuberculosis, cholera. We heard about typhoid, and new world diseases such as viruses. And then, of course, that led up to the COVID-19 pandemic. The bubonic plague, for example, is an old world disease, and it changed the way populations were transformed and how even wars have been won and lost based on infections. Tuberculosis. Pakistan is endemic for tuberculosis. It is one of the top 5 highly endemic countries. TB is identified a lot in females, for example, amongst cases. Typhoid we heard about, Dr. Farah talked about typhoid. And to understand these diseases, whether it's antibiotic resistance or the way they change, we need tools, we need molecular biology, we need immunology, we need to understand using scientific methods to understand what is really going on, what is the best way to treat them, to diagnose them. And I give you some examples through our COVID-19 research work that we had an opportunity to do based at the Aga Khan University in collaboration with international and national centers. And this was a period where we really were able to grow our networks, work with new scientists, and form new bonds and work in a very multidisciplinary manner. So we all know we lived through the pandemic. SARS-CoV spread rapidly. Its transmission was aided because of the way that we live, we interact, our transport, how much there is intermingling of populations. But we saw that while there were global deaths of about 7 million globally, it was only about 31,000 in Pakistan. So our focus was not just to look at how we could understand the infections in the laboratory, and my colleagues are here. We set up PCR-based diagnostic testing, like many labs, but AKU was one of the first to do it. And the testing we did, which was 500,000 cases in the first 2 years, really mapped the way that the COVID pandemic spread. And this placed us to also curate the virus and try and understand using genomic epidemiology what viruses were present. But one thing that stuck out is that most of the cases that were being identified, particularly in the first year, were all males. So all the national data was that there was more COVID in males. However, in our lab, it was apparent that while we were getting more male cases, the positivity rate between men and women was equal. So we published this work. This is published in BMC Public Health, and essentially, particularly in the first two years of the pandemic, there were more testing for men. Okay, so when you test men more, you get more male positive cases, and that is why people were saying there's more COVID in males. So that comes down to opportunity, it comes down to testing. And even when speaking to the field officers who were doing the sampling for COVID testing, the contact tracing they did was predominantly male, because how would they do it? They would go to apartment blocks and they would say, "Okay, ab log niche bhej rahe contact tracing ke liye." They wouldn't go into the houses, and who do they send out? They don't send out the young girls, they don't send out the women, they send out the children. They send out the boys for testing. So even the capture and the contact tracing was hugely variable, and things like that haven't been sufficiently documented. So you need to diagnose, you need to identify who's being tested, and that actually informs you in terms of where the disease is present. Anyway, so based on the genomic capacity we had, we moved from our previous bacterial genomics testing platforms to do SARS-CoV-2 diagnosis, and we identified the new variants as they evolved. We were one of the first to identify the transition from Wuhan to G-clade strains, then D-clade. We were the first to identify the alpha strain in 2021, and also the Omicron. And another piece of work was trying to understand circulation of virus. And this is work done by Dr. Bhutta's team. They did a seroprevalence study because it was not possible to do PCR testing. So seroepidemiological studies that were done by pediatrics, by Imran Nisar, by Dr. Bhutta, these showed transmission in the population. And these are important because it was not possible to do. So we have to think of what tools are available if we want to look at wide-scale spread, or identification of a disease, what tools do you use? And sometimes seroepidemiology, which really looks at the host response to infection, because you're measuring epidemiology, you're measuring antibodies, is very useful. So essentially, even in the early pandemic period, we had positivity rates of about 30%, and these rose to 80% before vaccines were introduced, okay? And we all know COVID vaccines were introduced at multiple levels. There was a lot of interest in effectiveness of vaccines. Vaccines were limited. We got the inactivated vaccine, mostly in Pakistan, and the vector-based vaccine. And there was a bit of mistrust, bit of confusion, and concern as to whether they were effective. So the initial studies were test-negative studies that compared effectiveness based on presence or absence of disease, and they showed there was differences in the way that you had more people who had COVID after receiving inactivated vaccines compared with mRNA vaccines. But we needed more information, and how do you look at that? How do you understand humoral immunity? How do you understand the T-cell response? Because those are the ones that are actually protecting you. One of the things we observed was that there was a lot of background positivity, seropositivity in people who hadn't even received vaccinations. And for that, we had tested pre-pandemic samples. Pre-pandemic means samples in the Sera Bank from 2014, 2018, and we found that even they had spiked positivity at a certain level. So we looked at whether or not there was any relationship between SARS-CoV-2 and circulating coronaviruses, and in fact it had been documented that there was cross-reactivity. And when we looked for cross-reactivity in the presence of IgG to those circulating coronaviruses, we found, in fact, positivity to two human coronaviruses, NL63 and OC43, that was highly prevalent in our population. And other people have also subsequently shown that the circulating coronaviruses do give you some level of protection. They're not specific antibodies. They're not driven by the COVID vaccine. However, we were able to show also that they were enhanced after vaccination, because we did a follow-up study where we looked at pre-pandemic sera. We compared it with healthy subjects in 2021, and after vaccinations with two kinds of vaccines, inactivated and mRNA vaccines, we were able to show that all your antibodies go up, okay? So this is really important. So understanding population immunity, understanding exposures in a population is very important when trying to understand the outcomes of certain disease. So just because there was transmission in the population doesn't mean everybody gets sick in the same way. And hence you can have differences in disease outcomes across global populations. Another piece of work that we were able to do, this is in collaboration with scientists in Portugal who had helped us establish a virus neutralizing assay. So to date in Pakistan, virus neutralizing assays have been quite limited because they require testing for the virus ability to invade cells. And you test it by looking to see how much cell killing you have. And this is because SARS-CoV-2 is a pathogen. It needs to be a cell-3 lab, so we used a pseudovirus assay. The pseudovirus assay essentially allows you to have a mimic in a lentivirus construct. So you're able to look at whether or not sera, your test sera, blocks the virus from entering your test cells, but it's safe to use. So this was an important development. It's been used. And it allows you to look at different genetic constructs from different viruses, because you can change the protein by changing the plasmid that is responsible and associated with a particular virus. And we were able to ask the question that using different vaccines in a population, and this was a big cohort study that we did in Matiari, again facilitated by the NRL and Dr. Bhutta's team. We did a follow-up study of people after they have received different kinds of vaccines, inactivated mRNA and vector vaccines. We compared serological responses. We looked to see what was different. You can read this paper in detail later, but essentially we found that all responses induced IgG to spike the bigger protein and RBD, the more specific protein. We did virus neutralizing assays, and then we looked at neutralizing titer not just to wild type, but to the Delta variant, okay? And that was important, and we found the mRNA was more protected, mRNA vaccines, after 6 months compared to the other vaccines. And then we asked the question, how can you predict the response to, say, the Omicron variant, which came later in 2024, against sera of people who were vaccinated in 2021, okay? Because those people had not been exposed to the Omicron infection. And we found, in fact, that there was limited neutralizing titer to Omicron JN1 in 2020, which was the 2024 virus. So how do you explain why we still have infections? You don't have titers against neutralizing activity. However, when we looked at cellular immunity, this is now interferon gamma from T cells, we were able to show that, in fact, these individuals show strong T cell responses, and your T cell responses are broader. So the cross-reactivity to spike across different variants of SARS-CoV-2 is stronger, it's more robust, and it is less variable than your humoral responses. And this explains why, while COVID infections still continue, they are mostly mild, because in a population that has been both exposed and vaccinated, they have been stimulated to produce both humoral and cellular responses. So I'll summarize that and say that it's important to conduct studies in infectious diseases to understand variations, using genomic epidemiological tools to try and understand the trends in disease severity. And we've done more work looking at even the transcriptional level host responses that define individuals infected with certain kinds of viruses, certain variants compared with others, and there are differences. So it's important to use your science, your molecular biology, and work with clinical colleagues, because all of this work was done in collaboration with large teams. And that will help us in the future also define the correct vaccination, which is part of prevention strategies, and in addition, correctly inform public health responses for disease prevention. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge support from the HEC grants, AKU, and my team at Pathology and Laboratory Medicine, colleagues at Cattolica Biomedical Institute, and Pediatrics, and BBS, who were all part of this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Zahra Hassan, for sharing with us your extensive work in the area of genomic surveillance and COVID-19 vaccines, specifically in Pakistan, but also for your work in the area of molecular diagnostics in infectious disease and oncology, which is so important to us, and your leadership for pathogen host biomarker research as well. So we appreciate sharing with the group. With that, we'll move to our next presentation, Kinza Bhutto. I'd like to invite Kinza Bhutto on the stage. Thank you, Dr. Kinza. So Kinza Bhutto is a PhD scholar in population and public health at the Aga Khan University and serves as manager of the Department of Surgery. Her research spans gender equity, adolescent health, health system strengthening. She has contributed to multi-country studies on reproductive health, migration, and gender disparities, with publications on BMJ at this level is remarkable. Kinza is committed to generating evidence in the area of adolescent health. So with that, Kinza, over to you for your work in Women in Science, and very happy that she's a colleague and a friend and a mentee in Women in Science.
Thank you so very much. Good afternoon and assalamu alaikum. I know we are low on energy, so I'll try one more time. Assalamu alaikum. That's great. So I would like to begin by thanking IHDHD, University of Oxford, and SickKids for giving me an opportunity to be part of the Women in Science Fellowship Cohort 1, which has been a remarkable and rewarding experience both academically and professionally. And with that, of course, I would like to thank my wonderful mentors, Dr. Rosina Carmeliani, who is here, looking beautiful as always, and Dr. Nargiz Asad, who is not here with us today in person. I took this opportunity to conduct a scoping review to understand the barriers to adolescent participation in sports. As we see, there has been a significant crisis unfolding in youth sports participation. From 70 to 80% of children by the age of 15 cease participation, and there are numerous reasons behind so. And there's been a recent drop that we see from 2019 to 2021, with 8.3% decrease being highlighted in high school sports. With that, there's a gender gap that unfolds, with girls consistently participating at lower rates compared to boys. As we can see here, 40% compared to 70% among boys. So this led us to an opportunity to conduct a qualitative systematic review. While quantitative studies help report participation rates and they identify patterns and they measure outcomes, but they fail to explain the experiences, emotions, and social context that shape the adolescent sports participation. Therefore, this review aims to foreground how adolescents feel about sports participation and the competition, how peer and family influences actually shape choices, and also how sport shapes adolescents' identity development. This led us to the research objective, which was to synthesize and contextualize global evidence on barriers to sports participation, to understand the specific gender disparities, to identify multi-level determinants influencing participation disparities across diverse cultural and socioeconomic settings, so in order to draw inclusive and equitable strategies for sustained sport participation. The methodology used for the scoping review was the SPIDER framework. The sample was adolescent experiences and perceptions regarding gender-related barriers. The phenomena itself was the gender-related barriers to sports participation. The design was qualitative approach. For evaluation, we've used framework analysis to identify key barriers and facilitators, and the research type was qualitative studies. In order to ensure rigor, we adhered to the PRISMA guidelines. For enhanced quality check, we did CAS checklist, and the protocol has been registered in Prospero. For the eligibility criteria, the inclusion criteria was qualitative studies which focus on adolescent sport participation and adolescent population across diverse settings. The exclusion criteria was quantitative studies which measure participation rates only, studies which are not focusing on organizational sports, and studies in languages other than English. We identified 3 major databases, which were PubMed, CINAHL, and Scopus, and of course we followed the process of screening, full text review, and final inclusion. As you can see in the PRISMA flowchart, we started off with 464 studies, and following the screening eligibility and the quality check, we included 10 articles were included in the qualitative synthesis. This slide shows a snapshot of the studies which are part of the scoping review, and the distribution of the studies varies from 20% in Middle East, 30% in America, 10% from Asia, and around 40% from Europe. The socio-ecological framework was also used to examine how social, cultural, and institutional factors, each one of these levels, interacted with one another to create gender disparities, gender disparities in adolescent sports participation. And the results were tabled across these 4 levels, which were individual level, interpersonal level, community level, and the policy level, to see how the barriers across these multiple levels interacted with distinct experiences at each one of those levels. We'll start with the individual level barriers. This review helped us identify that adolescents are very concerned about body images, and they're self-conscious about their body shape, about their attire, and there's a fear of judgment that persists. As a quote defines it, but that the young girl mentioned that adolescents may avoid sports due to discomfort in revealing clothing or fear of judgment. At the same time, they also highlighted puberty-related barriers. Concerns regarding playing during periods, early maturation concerns, or privacy concerns. As the quote highlights, that my mom does not allow me to play during periods as I might get stains on my uniform. That's very embarrassing. But at the same time, while we talk about this, there's an important need to highlight that they also identified that the low confidence and judgment plays a role. Not all individuals have a zeal to perform or participate in sports. As we can see, that one of the quotes ironically mentions that not all boys are naturally drawn to team sports or competitive activities. This is something that is not often talked about. At the second interpersonal level barriers, we saw family influences that parents are often seen prioritizing academics over sports. And this, of course, there also leads to gender expectations as the domestic responsibilities from girls are highlighted or given more preference rather than participating in physical activity. This quote is the essence of it, which from a very young boy who states that family support can be a getaway or a barrier to participation. My brother and dad really motivate me to play football, but my sister was asked to cook. At the same time, peer influences also are one of the important hurdles, as this quote highlights that peer influence can create pressure to conform to group activities. I want to play tennis, but all my friends sit and discuss TV shows during PE time. And this also leads us to social support networks, and that societal norms can actually limit opportunities. As a girl quotes that we don't have many female sportswomen to look up to. This transitions into the community and organizational barriers in terms of access and transportation was highlighted as one of the important hurdles. But there were very limited safe facilities. There's a lack of basic infrastructure such as changing room for young girls, safety concerns when traveling to and from activities. At the same time, there are also a few flaws in the program design and culture. We have overly competitive structures where we prioritize winning rather than skill development. And we have male-dominant environment and very female coaches that are looked up to. While we talk about limited female coaches, also essential to highlight that there are also ghost post teachers and under-resourced settings. And lastly, financial implications. So the equipment cost or membership fees or training gear or uniform costs or travel expenses are important cost barriers that eventually lead to a decline in participation over the years. And lastly, the policy level barriers, we saw media and representation gaps with underrepresentation of female athletes in media coverage and also sporting events, which eventually limit the role models for these young girls. And the lack of gender responsive policies at the school level, at the sport body level, and the very few national policies that actually prioritize adolescent girls' participation. With that, of course, there's also weak reinforcement in terms of monitoring mechanisms or accountability structures that often ignore gender equity. So we discussed that, that these barriers at individual, social, institutional, and societal level interact with one another to restrict participation. There are also certain gender expectations, there are cultural ideals around puberty, around femininity, around safety, modesty, academic priority that shape choices that eventually lead to structural inequities. This leads us to our key recommendations. It is imperative, it is essential to build confidence early on. We have to encourage sports from early childhood, and this begins at home. These pictures are of my son who has been encouraged to play sports from the age of 2. So this helps us in ensuring that these young men and women participate in sports through childhood to adolescence till adulthood. And while we do that, we have to initiate dialogues and promote conversations around menstrual and puberty literacy. We have to encourage parents to value sports alongside academics. We have to ensure a safe and affordable sports facility for girls. And lastly, we have to talk about implementation science to understand what works for whom and under what conditions. The strengths of the scoping review was that that's a qualitative synthesis which centers around adolescent lived experiences with contextually rich insights. We have followed a social ecological framework to analyze the multi-level determinants and their interconnections. For methodological rigor, we adhered to PRISMA guidelines and quality check through CATS checklist. But nonetheless, there are a few limitations such as the language restriction. We have only included English language studies. The sample size is small in terms of only 10 studies have been part of the review, and the geographic gaps in terms of limited representation from LMICs. These are the references, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kinza, for also bringing some of the personal experiences that how parental skills early on at early childhood level can shape adolescent later on and can help us shape the gender inequity issues as well. So we are moving to our next presenter. Our next presenter comes from Islamabad, Sabeen Abid Khan from Shifa Tamir-e-Millat University. Dr. Sabeen, Dr. Sabine, yeah, if you can take the stage and open your presentation. Thank you. So Dr. Sabine Abid Khan is an associate professor of pediatrics at Shifa College of Medicine. Her academic and clinical work focuses on community pediatrics, early childhood development, and preventive child health. She brings with her extensive experience in teaching clinical research and programmatic work addressing the child growth, nutrition, and the developmental health. She's a very strong advocate for strengthening child health along with the health systems in Pakistan. Over to you, Dr. Sabine.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind introduction. So let's change gears now from malnutrition and micronutrient deficiencies to talk about the other side of malnutrition now, which is childhood obesity. So I'll be talking about risk factor assessment of metabolic syndrome in children and adolescents with obesity in Pakistan. So the World Health Organization defines obesity as a chronic, progressive, and disabling disease. It is predicted by the Lancet report that more than half of adults and 1/3 of children and adolescents will be obese by 2050. Globesity is the new terminology, which means that obesity is global. It is not a problem of high-income countries anymore. It is predicted that the steepest increase in obesity in the coming years will be seen in lower middle-income countries, and Pakistan stands as no exception. You can see from this World Obesity Federation website data from 2021 that in the adolescence age group, we are already reaching a prevalence of 12%, and the younger age group is also catching up. The problem with adolescents obesity is that 80% of these adolescents will be adults with obesity. And when it comes to children, 50% of these will be adolescents with obesity. So what is metabolic syndrome? Obesity increases the risk of central adiposity, hypertension, dyslipidemias, abnormal glucose, and insulin regulation, and these are together termed as metabolic syndrome. It is a complex phenomenon. You can see from the figure, the picture that I've shared, that it has significant long-term health implications. On top of that, there is a lack of standardized definition in children, and up to 40 definitions of metabolic syndrome have been proposed so far. So the American Academy of Pediatrics says that rather than defining metabolic syndrome, we should shift our focus on identifying the risk factors, the cardiometabolic risk factors. And early screening and early management can prevent the many long-term complications associated with metabolic syndrome. When it comes to obesity and metabolic syndrome, a lot is known about lifestyle and diet. But when it comes to genetic and epigenetic programming, our knowledge, I think, is still evolving. And as Dr. Samad was mentioning in the morning, the genetic components, consanguinity in our local setup, the parental cardiometabolic health, the socioeconomics classification has an important role to play. Keeping these in mind, we planned a study to understand the prevalence of metabolic syndrome in children and adolescents with obesity in an urban setting in Islamabad. To understand the risk factors associated with metabolic syndrome, particularly the role of parental obesity, parental cardiometabolic health, and their socioeconomic status. It was a single-center cross-sectional study done in pediatric OPD of Shifa Falhai Community Health Center, done over 10 months. Children 2 to 16 years of age were included who were either overweight or obese, and both of their parents were also enrolled in the study. We excluded secondary causes of obesity, and a detailed data collection form was drafted. Different measurements were taken, and SPSS 23 was used, analyzing univariate analysis, chi-square, t-test, and binary logistic regressions. For the definition of metabolic syndrome, we used the modified NCP adult treatment plan criteria, which says that out of these 5, if 3 or more are present, a child is said to have metabolic syndrome. And these include central adiposity, measured as waist circumference more than 90th centile for age and gender, hypertension more than 90th centile, age, gender, height, fasting serum triglycerides more than 100, low HDL cholesterol less than 40, and insulin resistance measured as fasting blood glucose in children more than 110 milligram deciliter. We use the CDC criteria for defining overweight and obesity in children. If it was more than 85th centile, overweight, and more than 95th was labeled as obesity. And for their parents, we used again the CDC criteria, overweight as BMI more than 25 and obesity more than 30. What we actually did was we screened during the study period more than 5,700 children. 195 were identified, and finally 150 were included. There was a greater reluctance from parents that childhood obesity is a problem. The variables that we recorded for children were weight, height, BMIs, blood pressure recorded, put on centile charts, waist circumference taken, put on age and gender centile charts by Fernandez, Waist to height ratio was taken more than 0.5 as significant because this is a marker of central adiposity and independent marker for poor cardiometabolic health itself. All these children underwent fasting sample for lipid profile and blood sugar analysis to meet the criteria of metabolic syndrome. For the 300 parents that were included in the study, BMI is calculated cardiometabolic health assessed through a questionnaire that included 10 questions related to dyslipidemias, hypertension, and family history of similar condition. Socioeconomic status identified through the modified Kupuswamy scale converted from Indian rupees into Pakistani rupees. So when it comes to the results on 150 children, we saw, so boys were 77 and girls were 73. Majority of our children were obese, 117, and only 33 were overweight. Obesity was mainly seen in lower socioeconomic families. 81 families, and middle class were only 47, and the upper class were 22. Out of the 150 children, we saw metabolic syndrome in 58 children that mounts to 38.7. The mean weight, height, BMI were all statistically significant, and the waist ratio of more than 0.5 was seen in 122 children out of 150. When we looked at the age group classification, 9 children were obese and 3 had metabolic syndrome. And you can see that with the increasing age group, the prevalence of metabolic syndrome is increasing. When we talk about the parental parameters, only 20 fathers had BMI in the normal category, and almost 87% were either overweight or obese. When it comes to mothers, again, you can see only 30 had normal BMI, the rest are either overweight or obese. Consanguinity in our study is highly prevalent. 88 families reported consanguinity. When you look at children with metabolic syndrome, out of these 58, 45 had both their parents either overweight or obese. And 8 had only fathers obese, 3 had only mothers obese, and only 2 children who had both parents falling into the normal BMI category. When we looked at the age group differences, metabolic syndrome is highly prevalent in adolescence age group with significant associations with weight, height, BMI, waist to height ratio, waist circumference, systolic and diastolic blood pressure. Gender differences were not found to be very much significant between male and female, except for the waist to height ratio, and the waist circumference was higher in males. So this is the results related to the metabolic complications seen in our population. 58.7% had raised triglycerides. Waist circumference, 58% again, these are the most common ones. But look at these, 50% of the study population already had blood pressure more than 98th centile. So this is a very important bar chart because we know that if 3 or more complications are present, that child had metabolic syndrome. But what about this big number of 47? They already had 2 of the components of metabolic syndrome. Similarly, 32 had at least 1 component of metabolic syndrome. It was only 13 children out of this 150 which we called that they had metabolic healthy obesity. We studied the association of maternal BMI categories with childhood parameters and again found significant differences with respect to weight, height, BMI, and blood pressure. Lastly, we did a comparison of the parental cardiometabolic health questionnaire. So this is the questionnaire where we asked questions from fathers. This is from mothers, and again we studied it into socioeconomic classes. So we can see all the problems were highly prevalent in the lower socioeconomic class. The heart diseases, this is about atherosclerotic heart disease, blood pressure, lipids, diabetes, all you can see. But there is something very important, which is this family history of hypertension, atherosclerotic heart disease, or diabetes. This is highly prevalent in all the categories on the mother side and the father side and the mother side. And this highlights the intergenerational transfer of risk factors when it comes to cardiometabolic health. So this is an analysis as parental cardiometabolic health as catalyst for child's health. When you see that this blue is the impact from father and the red is from mothers. So when there's a paternal history of atherosclerotic heart disease, it's impacting the child in terms of higher BMI. Similarly, early deaths due to heart diseases, it is impacting in terms of significantly raised triglycerides. If there's a maternal history of diabetes or a family history on the maternal side of hypertension, heart diseases, or diabetes, it is associated with raised diastolic blood pressure and raised triglycerides in children. Finally, we applied the binary logistic regression with metabolic syndrome as a dependent variable and found significant associations of age, systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, serum triglycerides, and paternal BMI. So our study shows high prevalence of metabolic syndrome in adolescents and in the lower socioeconomic families. So we know that the atherosclerotic process starts in childhood from the famous Framingham study. So these are the children who are at risk, twofold increased risk of this problem, and they are also at fivefold risk of diabetes mellitus. When we compare our prevalence of metabolic syndrome from the regional countries, we saw that Iran has reported up to 7.6%, Saudi Arabia 20.8%, and European countries, different countries from 30 to 54%. So parental cardiometabolic health is a strong predictor of poor health outcomes in children. It is often unrecognized because the current obesity management guidelines in children do not take these into account. These findings highlight the need of family-centered strategies that address parental risk factors more effectively to improve child's metabolic health. Early identification can prevent the numerous complications associated with metabolic syndrome and all the list of non-communicable diseases, not only for the child, but the whole family. These are some of my references. Thank you very much for the Swiss team for being really supporting, for my amazing mentor, Dr. Sana Sayyar, and my research team back in Islamabad.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sabeen, for bringing to us early identification and family-based strategies and the importance of it. Last but not the least, our audience is fantastic. So congratulations, Dr. Bhutta and Dr. Jay, for putting such a wonderful program. Nobody wants to move for lunch so far. And also to our fantastic speakers who are keeping so well with time and bringing fantastic knowledge, very relevant to the audience. So here comes our final speaker before we go for lunch, Kiran Abbas. Dr. Kiran Abbas is at Aga Khan University. She is a medical doctor and advanced training in health policy and management, extensive leadership experience in health research and community development. She is the founder of a research organization named Uplifting Futures, focusing on women's empowerment. Her scientific work includes studies on brain tumor and environmental stresses. She's a recipient of the Women in Science Fellowship and Research Grant Award. She was also offered a PhD position at the University of York for her cancer research work. Over to you, Dr. Kiran Abbas, for your 8 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just further clarification, Uplifting Futures in an organization that promotes adolescent mental and physical health and also promote women empowerment. And I was offered a University of York a PhD scholarship, but it was not cancer related, but thank you so much. I'll just begin by this prop here. Studies now suggest that what I'm holding, a sandwich bag full of plastic, is roughly what ends up inside the human body over time, especially in the brain. In recent years, scientists have confirmed that the environmental chemicals we encounter daily, including metals and nanoplastics, can cross into the brain and trigger cellular stress. So we asked a critical question: if healthy brain cells can react to these exposures, how much more vulnerable and sensitive are brain cancer cells? Our study explores exactly that. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Kiran Abbas, and I'm delighted to present our work on how environmental stressors influence the expression of heat shock protein. Heat shock protein in glioblastoma cells. This study is part of our broader effort to understand how the environment interacts with cancer cell biology and how these interactions may drive treatment resistance. HSP70 is a molecular chaperone that is essential for maintaining protein stability and preventing cellular damage. In cancer, however, HSP70 does something entirely different. It becomes an ally of the tumor. It blocks apoptosis, it stabilizes oncoproteins, it helps repair DNA, and ultimately leads to tumor survival. So the key question we asked was, what happens when cancer cells are exposed to environmental stresses at doses we normally encounter? Our study had two main objectives. Firstly, to quantify changes in HSP expression when in glioblastoma cells exposed to cadmium, bisphenol A, and aspartame. Secondly, to determine whether these changes are dose-dependent. our study followed a carefully structured workflow, including culture, controlled exposure, viability testing, and protein expression analysis via Western blotting and densitometry. Now let's talk about the findings quickly. These images might look scary, but across all these different stressors, including bisphenol, cadmium, and aspartame, the message is quite clear. Across all these three stressors, the cell viability remained high. The doses we used were below toxic levels, and the cells were still very much alive. This is crucial because it means that any biological changes we see here is not because the cells were dying, but because they were responding. These next slides represent the crux of our study. For what we observed consistently is a dose-responsive increase in HSP70 expression at subtoxic concentrations. For cadmium, HSP70 expression rose sharply at 20 micromolar and declined at higher levels, suggesting that moderate stress stimulates that chaperone effect of HSP70, but excessive stress may overwhelm the system. For bisphenol A, even extremely low concentrations as low as 0.3 micromolar, as you can see from the graph, triggered a significant rise in HSP expression. This is worrying because these are the levels found in a typical environment. Aspartame induced a similar pattern with HSP peaking around 20 micromolar before plateauing. Across all three stresses, we see a clear trend. Environmental exposures are priming cancer cells for survival by upregulating HSP70. These findings mirror what is reported in literature. Exposure to environmental chemicals put a strain on cells. For glioblastoma, this means greater anti-apoptotic capacity, stronger DNA repair ability, and potentially heightened resistance to treatments like temozolomide and radiation. This implies that environmental exposures may silently strengthen cancer cells, and in ways we do not currently consider in clinical management. While our controlled dose response design is a major strength, a key limitation is that it assesses only a single protein, that is HSP70. Our next steps would include validating these findings on primary glioblastoma cells derived from patients and exploring downstream survival pathways, including stemness factors, and using 3D cultures. This work was supported by the Institute of Global Health and Development and the University of Oxford, and I'm deeply grateful to Dr. Atay Inam and Dr. Azhar Hussain for their mentorship and guidance, along with our entire research team for their invaluable contribution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kiran Abbas. With this, we have time for 2 questions in the interest of time. So I would like all the speakers to be taking the chairs on the podium here so the audience can refer their questions to you. So since I have the microphone, I can go ahead and start the first one. And my question is to Professor Zahra. While you did a lot of work in the genomic surveillance during the COVID-19 time, what was your learning and the experience for the adolescent group particularly? Did you find anything different in adolescent versus the overall population when you were working in the area of vaccine for COVID-19?
Thank you for the question. So in our study where we looked at the stratification of people who were tested, the gender balance, we found there was no difference between males and females adolescent who were tested. So there was no difference in testing. There was a difference in older women, so less older women above 60 were tested, and less young children were tested. With regard to the vaccine study, unfortunately, we were focusing on adults, because children had a different vaccination strategy. If you remember, they were given mRNA vaccines. So at the time that we conducted the study, the vaccine comparison was done in the 18 and above age groups so that we could compare the vaccines.
So much. Any other comment or question? Hearing none, it appears that we all need our glucose levels to be up and ready for the soul and the physical requirement, so prayer time and the lunch time. So I would just conclude by saying that adolescent population in Pakistan is a growing population in the world. So 35% is between the 10 to 24 years of age. And we have neglected this population for a long time. And therefore, I think multi-level strategies are required. Therefore, you heard multi-level and different discipline presentations here, from environment to infection to lifestyle modification to gender equity. And so purposely these areas were together. So you don't think that these are not adolescent issues: environment, genomics, infections, metabolic syndrome, and certainly the gender inequality. And working with the gender transformation is our priority to strengthen our adolescent group, because they are not our future, they are today. And so working with the larger population of 35% for today and for future is the goal here. So I really like to appreciate those who created this program and then kept this space, especially for the adolescents' health, with the area of environment, infection, gender, and all the nutritional issues which adolescents face. And thank you all the presenters for bringing the areas where parental engagement, community engagement, education, policy, institutional efforts, and family strategies are important. And therefore, parental skills early on from ECD were the emphasis which some of the speakers brought here. With that, I would like to hand back microphone to our MC here.
Thank you, Dr. Rosina, for chairing this session. Now I would request Dr. Rosina Karmalyani and Dr. Zahra Hassan to present the mementos to our fellows. Dr. Kanza Bhatto. Dr. Sabine Abel. Dr. Kinza Abbas. Kiran Abbas, I'm so sorry. All right. Now I would request Dr. Rosina Karmalyani and Dr. Zahra Hassan to present the mementos to each other. Or maybe I would request Dr. Mutta to kindly present the mementos. Thank you, everyone.